Well, thank you very much. I'm really extremely delighted to be invited by the Polish Chamber of Commerce to speak here in Warsaw. I feel I have a long-time connection with this country. I visited Warsaw for the first time in May of 1989 when I was working for the State Department, and the elder George H.W. Bush came and spoke in Gdansk. I was at that speech, and I remember at that time there was this tremendous sense of hope and optimism after the roundtable talks. And it's just really, every time I've been back, it's been such a delight to actually see Poland develop as a modern democracy, as a market-oriented democracy, and to be doing so well. So I want to congratulate you and say hello to all of my friends in this country. So the topic that this Congress has undertaken in this beautiful new Copernicus Center, I think is a really critical one for all economies, which has to do with the question of innovation, entrepreneurship. I think that in many respects, the economic success that Poland has seen over the last 20 years is the result of, in a sense, catching up to the rest of Europe. Low labor costs, becoming a factory for other firms. But if Poland is actually to move ahead in the coming 20 years, the basis for productivity and economic growth, I think, has to be rather different. And so I want to talk about the role of trust in a modern economy and the way that the factor of trust is critical. Now, I have a question. Can I move away from this podium? That's not going to cause a problem for the cameras. Okay. In that case, I'll move to the center where I can see my own slides better. So if I could get the next slide, please. Oh, do I have a? Actually, I can. All right. Sorry. Good. Okay. All right. So what I want to talk today about is a factor of production called social capital. We are all familiar with physical capital, which is things like land, labor, buildings. We're also familiar with human capital, which is the knowledge and education that we carry around with us in our heads. So it is an intangible form of capital, but is very critical in a modern economy. But there's actually a third type of capital, which has been labeled social capital, that really has to do with the ability of people to cooperate in common enterprises for the sake of common goals. And I think that this is absolutely critical in helping us understand the way that economies actually work. Now, the definition that I would give of social capital is a set of informal norms that permit people to work together in groups and associations. We all know about formal organization. We have laws, we have labor unions and companies that operate by formal charters. But social capital really has to do, in a sense, with moral values, values of honesty, of reciprocity, of fulfilling commitments that allow people to interact on a flexible basis. And I think it has very important both economic and political uses. Social capital, in this sense, has an economic function by reducing what economists call transaction costs. That is to say, you can cooperate with people using contracts, lawyers, you can sue people in court, you can use all of the apparatus of a modern rule of law. But if you are able to honestly interact with other people to resolve disputes informally, then you are going to save on transaction costs. You don't have to pay all the lawyers, the courts, the enforcement, the police that go along with opportunism. On a political level, social capital is also very critical because in a democracy, individuals are weak, they're weak as individuals. We only can enter the political system if we can work together with people who share our interests and our passions and our concerns to operate in civil society or to enter the political system in an organized fashion through political parties and the like. And this is one of the reasons that I think many observers, like the great observer of American democracy, Alexis de Tocqueville, said that social capital, this ability to cooperate, is really critical for the functioning of a modern democracy. So social capital is based on common values, but not all values are the same. There's a famous book that was written by an American political scientist, Edward Banfield, in the 1950s about southern Italy, which many people recognize to be one of the lowest trust regions of Europe. And he said, in fact, there are shared values in southern Italy. He wrote about a small town called Montegrano, somewhere south of Naples. And he said, in this town, there is a common norm which says, you take advantage of everybody else before they take advantage of you, because if you don't do it first, they're going to do it to you. And he said, the result of this is that nobody can cooperate in a group in this part of Italy outside of their immediate nuclear family. He labeled this phenomenon what he called amoral familism, meaning the only source of association is the immediate family. And this has terrible consequences in a way for the operation of the economy and for politics in the southern part of Italy. This part of Italy, including Sicily, is famous for the mafia, for organized crime, for a high degree of political corruption, and it has over the centuries been the least developed part of Italy, in part because it's very hard to establish strong private sector organizations because of this fundamental lack of trust. The really dynamic parts of the Italian economy have all been in the north, where you had city-states like Genoa, Florence, Turin, Bologna, in which the ability of people to cooperate has been much greater. Now, social capital, this ability to cooperate, does not exist in all parts of the world equally. So as I said, southern Italy is very different from northern Italy. In Asia, you have a very interesting distinction between the nature of cooperation in China and in Japan. We somehow tend to think of these all as Confucian societies, but in fact they're very different. In Japan, you have a social system that I would label high trust, because in Japanese society, it is relatively easy for people to cooperate with one another outside of the immediate nuclear family. This has to do with reasons stemming from Japan's early social development, that loyalty to your political lord was always more important than loyalty to your immediate family. And this is very different from the kind of moral system that exists in China, where the family is the basic unit of social cooperation. And so you can illustrate this in the following way. In China, it is very clear that, let's say, you're living in a wealthy family in China, and your father is accused of some crime, and the police knock at your door and they say, "Where's your father? Tell us where your father is." By the tenets of traditional Confucian morality, you should not tell the police where your father is, because your loyalty to the family is more important than your loyalty to the state. And therefore, this has consequences for the development of Chinese businesses, particularly in southern China, where the family is particularly strong, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in other parts of Fujian province. Businesses revolve around individual families. They're handed down from father to son to grandchildren, and it is relatively difficult in that social setting to create a modern publicly owned corporation, because it is difficult for people to trust one another outside the bounds of the family. And so many of the big businesses in that part of China tend to be state-owned businesses because only the state can organize a large-scale organization. This is very different in Japan because in Japan you have a much stronger tradition of cooperation outside of the family. So for example, in Japan, in that same situation where the father has committed a crime and the police come looking for the father, in Japanese morality you say you report where your father is because your obligation to the state, to obeying the laws of the state, is stronger than your obligation to your immediate family. And this is one of the reasons why in the course of Japan's modernization in the 19th century, you had the growth of a number of very large modern corporations at a relatively early stage in Japan's development. The famous names that we know, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Mitsui, these large trading companies were all originally family-owned businesses, but already by the end of the 19th century, they had evolved into modern, hierarchically managed corporations because in that high-trust social setting, it was relatively easy to bring in a manager who was not a relative, who could be hired simply for ability rather than the fact that he was a member of your family. Whereas the scale of businesses in China tended to stay small because trust existed only within these family units. Now, a lot of this has changed. China has evolved. The family, in a certain sense, has weakened as a result of the experience of communism and Maoism in the 20th century. So in some respects, these cultural differences have been eroded, but it indicates that even in the modern world, the radius of trust, that is to say, the degree to which people can work together, to the degree to which they have social capital outside the family, is very critical in explaining the nature of organizations and the scale of organizations that are possible. The United States has traditionally been seen as a high-trust society. That is to say, Americans are very good at working together in groups and organizations. Now, this is a little bit hard to reconcile with the fact that in our political system right now, nobody trusts anybody else. There's been a great deal of polarization and bitterness between Republicans and Democrats, which I think has been responsible for a lot of the gridlock in our political system. But what I'm talking about when I talk about trust is really the ability of people in society to spontaneously work together in civil society. So even an organization like the Tea Party, this right-wing group that's grown up as part of the Republican Party over the last couple of years in reaction to Obama's presidency, it's really actually an example of the ability of Americans to come together and to operate in civil society. You may disagree with their political objectives, but they're very good at cooperating, and in fact they're so good at organizing that they succeeded in getting a lot of Republicans elected to the Congress in the 2010 election. And so I think this has traditionally been a case where trust in the society remains very strong, even if trust in government at a political level has really deteriorated. If you go to another place like Latin America, you have, in a way, a very different situation. It's a lot like southern China or southern Italy, where it's only within the boundaries of the family that you get social capital and trust. And therefore, in many Latin American countries, the business community is organized around a few very wealthy families who own networks of interrelated companies and control maybe 50% of the economy. And this is, again, the result of a distribution of social capital that makes it difficult for people to make connections and operate with people outside of their immediate network of friends and family. All right, so this is a general overview of the subject of social capital. why it's important and how it plays out in certain specific societies. But from now on, I want to talk about the way that social capital operates in the context of modern organization, because in terms of the theme of this conference, I think that social capital and trust are critical to the development of modern entrepreneurship and to fostering innovation in modern organizations. As you're probably aware, there's been a major revolution in the nature of corporations and business firms over the last 50, 60, 70 years. So I would say that at kind of the largest level, there's been a radical shift in the nature of authority in the workplace, in corporations, in business organization, where you have moved from traditional hierarchies to more flexible forms of organization. They could be flat organizations, they could be virtual firms, or they could be outright networks. Let me just illustrate. So this is what we're all familiar with what a traditional hierarchy looks like. The Henry Ford organization that this entrepreneur created in Detroit in the first 2 decades of the 20th century looked like this. You had a military-style hierarchy, command and control hierarchy, that was controlled from the top, in which you had an extensive division of labor, and in which the primary lines of authority ran vertically from the top to the bottom. All right, and this was, in a sense, codified by the industrial engineer Frederick Winslow Taylor, who wrote a book in the first decade of the 20th century called Scientific Management, in which he talked about the efficiency of modern organizations deriving from this kind of military-style organization, hierarchical organization. So what's happened in recent decades, you've moved away from strict hierarchies to much flatter forms of corporate organization, flat organizations in which a certain amount of authority is pushed down to lower levels of the organization so that people at the bottom of the organization take on much more responsibility for making decisions, and in which some of the responsibility is also pushed upwards to the high levels of the organization, and you strip out some of the layers of middle management. At least that's the way it's supposed to work. All right, so the span of control of an individual manager increases oftentimes fairly dramatically. So in certain high-tech companies, in theory, you have 100 or 1,000 people reporting directly to the CEO, rather than just an executive vice president and a group of maybe half a dozen vice presidents. All right, so that's a flat organization. You've also had the virtualization or the outsourcing from vertically integrated companies to what's been called a virtual corporation, in which you outsource manufacturing, sometimes design, sometimes marketing. There are certain semiconductor factories, companies in Silicon Valley that basically all they do is the design. The manufacturing is done by a different fab in a completely different part of the country. The marketing is done by yet a third organization. And part of the information technology revolution has facilitated this kind of organization, because the classic economic explanation for why you had a vertically integrated company was transaction costs, that it was much cheaper to keep all of these functions within the boundaries of a single organization. But with the internet, with low transportation costs, it's now possible to outsource many of these functions to places. They don't even have to be within the same jurisdiction. They can be in other countries. We're all familiar now with the way that supply chain management has gotten internationalized across really vast distances and so forth. And then finally, you can have a completely decentralized organization, which is basically a network in which there's really no single centralized source of authority. There's only there's only horizontal cooperation, or sometimes you can conceive of it as a set of informal alliances between groups that may have some degree of hierarchy, but there's, again, no central source of direction to this. Probably the best illustration of this kind of a network is the open source software movement, which created Linux and a number of other important products. This is really, in a certain way, you can see that this is based on a particular set of informal moral norms, because the open source movement otherwise makes no sense in pure economic terms. In open source software, you have a whole bunch of software developers that are basically donating for free their work as a developer, putting it up on the web, letting anyone use it and modify it and apply it in others, and then commercialize it, as in the case of Linux. And this makes no sense if we are simply economic animals, if we're Homo economicus, because basically you're giving away valuable intellectual property, you're not getting compensated for it, and it's really based on an idea of reciprocity, that the people that do this feel, if I give away this material for free, somebody else is going to give material and I'm going to get back as much as I gave in the end. And so it really depends on a sense of sharing and reciprocity. I would actually say this evolved out of the kind of hippie culture of the San Francisco Bay Area, where people were very much opposed to the profit motive and to the narrow guarding of intellectual property. And so this is an example of a completely decentralized organization producing something of relatively high intellectual value, all right? So how do these new forms of organization operate? I would say that you cannot possibly understand the operation of these new types of organization without the concept of social capital, because the only way that you can replace formal modes of authority, top-down, Taylorite authority, is by the substitution of formal rules with informal norms. Remember, I said the definition of social capital was informal norms that promoted the exchange on a reciprocal basis of goods, ideas, innovation, and the like. And this is the way that these organizations work. Now, why is it that we've moved to this type of organization? And I think this is the limit case of Taylorism. Why is it that old hierarchical style organizations are no longer adequate? And why is it that social capital then becomes necessary, right? I think that a lot of the explanation for this really has to do with the need for delegation. That is to say, a hierarchical form of authority assumes that all of the knowledge and wisdom lies at the top of the organization. If you think back to the classic Henry Ford automobile factory, you had a bunch of managers living in a glass tower that gave instructions to this hierarchy of workers. At that time, let's say the year 1915, when Henry Ford introduced a $5 a day wage for his auto workers in Detroit, 50% of all assembly line workers in the United States could not speak English because they were recent immigrants. A lot of them were, in fact, immigrants from Poland, working in auto factories in Detroit and Michigan and other parts of the Midwest. If you think about what it's like to operate in that kind of an environment, it's almost inevitably a low-trust environment, because the managers, if the managers and the workers don't even share a common language, they really have to be controlled through these command and control types of incentives, where you pay people for showing up for work, punching their time card, and so forth. And so the Taylorite system, this hierarchical system, is one that will work in a very low trust environment. You don't have to have particular cooperation between workers and managers. They don't have to share values. They don't have to have the same culture. They don't even have to speak the same language. But what's been going on in modern organizations is levels of, let's see, so the levels of education have been changing, and this helps very much in an organization processing local knowledge. This was one of the great insights about why communism never worked as an economic system. Friedrich Hayek, the great libertarian economist, wrote a very influential article in the 1940s called The Uses of Local Knowledge, or The Uses of Knowledge in Society. He was arguing at that point against Joseph Schumpeter. There was a big debate going on whether communism was a more efficient economic form of organization. You know, today we say it's ridiculous. We all know that communism didn't work. In the 1940s, the Soviet Union had been growing for 2 decades at a much faster rate than the United States or Britain or other capitalist societies, which had just gone through the Great Depression, where capitalist markets looked like they were creating poverty, they were out of control, and the planned centralized Soviet economy was actually on a much faster growth path. And so you had a serious debate over which of these economic systems, central planning or dispersed markets, would work better. What Hayek said was, I think, probably the most important insight. He had many insights. He was a really great thinker, but his most important insight was the problem with central planning was the problem of local knowledge. He said in any economy, 99% of the important information was local in nature. So if you had a production process, the parts you were getting didn't fit because they were the wrong specification, the person that knew that was going to be the hourly worker at the bottom of the hierarchy, and not the executive living in a glass tower in the central management. And to the extent that you could move the authority for making decisions down to where the knowledge was being generated, you would have a more efficient system. And that's why Hayek said a capitalist market economy in the end is going to be more efficient than a centrally planned one, because the centrally planned economy cannot process information in an efficient manner. And what a market economy represents is the dispersion of decision-making authority across the entire economic spectrum, where people could act on local knowledge, buying and selling to one another, that in the end would have the impact of being socially efficient, because they were the ones that knew what the local conditions were. And in fact, as we now know, communism, it collapsed for many reasons. I think the most important ones were moral and political, but it also collapsed as an economic system because something like Gosplan, the Soviet Gosplan, assumed that some minister in Moscow could make every pricing decision throughout the entire Soviet economy. And as we all know, that never worked in any communist economy, that in fact you had to have a lot of corruption and informal exchange among factory managers simply to make that highly rigid system actually function properly. And one of the things that happens when you shift to a market economy is you give authority to make decisions to people that are much closer to local knowledge. Now, if you translate that into the practice of modern corporations, you see that the old hierarchical Henry Ford type of factory doesn't work either, because that kind of factory, again, assumes that most of the knowledge in the organization resides at the top management level and not at the level of the factory floor. But in a modern organization, that's actually not where knowledge exists. Local knowledge is still absolutely critical. And as you move into a high-tech environment where the actual workers are no longer first-generation immigrants that don't speak the language of their managers, but are now PhD-educated engineers, biologists, scientists of various sorts, it becomes clear that the manager has no particular authority over the worker. In fact, in a software firm, the software designers themselves are the only ones that are really capable of monitoring what they're doing. The manager has no idea actually what's gone on in the code. All he or she knows is whether it works or not. And therefore, there has to be a delegation of authority down to that lower level of the organization. And so in a way, the flattening and dispersal of authority in an organization is the inevitable product of the higher levels of education in the workforce. There's actually a nice illustration of this, even in a traditional factory. You know, one of the big innovations that the Japanese came up with was the so-called Kanban system of just-in-time manufacturing, which was implemented. It was invented in the 1950s and 60s at Toyota. It then became, it spread to Ford and other North American manufacturers. This is the system where inventories are kept to a minimum and in which if a factory worker, this is the famous thing in the Toyota factory, where if a factory worker sees that something doesn't fit, you know, the part that they're getting doesn't fit when they're trying to put together the chassis of a car that's going down the assembly line, they've got a cord that they can pull. If they pull the cord, the entire output of the factory stops, and not a single car is produced until that problem is solved. Now, many, I think, managers misunderstood why this is an efficient system. They thought all you're doing is saving on inventory costs because you don't have to maintain large inventories of spare parts into this system. That's not the essence of this. The essence of this is a system of trust that can then make use of local knowledge, because the insight that the Toyota engineers had was that it is the factory worker at the bottom of the hierarchy that has the best view of what the actual problems in the production process are. And by allowing that factory worker to pull the cord and stop the entire production line, that gives the factory as a whole a tremendous incentive to fix these problems before they are built into the car. And so the traditional Detroit factory that was based on the hierarchical principle, every one of them had 15% of their floor space devoted to trying to fix quality problems that were built into the automobiles they manufactured. And Toyota figured out that if you have this kind of dispersed system of authority, you're not going to make those mistakes in the first place, and therefore you can produce better quality cars and you can produce them more efficiently. So what does this depend on? It depends on trust. If you give every factory worker the right to pull a cord and stop the entire output of the factory, it means that if you've got really terrible management labor problems in which the labor unions regard management as evil or out to exploit them, what are they going to do? They're going to pull the cord all the time just to spite the managers. And so there has to be a sense of common purpose between the workers and the managers for this kind of a system to work. And the managers have to accept the fact that the workers actually know something, that they can make decisions on their own in terms of the production process and what the most efficient way of organizing that production process is. And so all of the big innovations that took place in the, you know, the 90s, in the late 80s and 90s, with teams and with, you know, pushing authority down, reflected the fact that you were moving to a different kind of organization in which authority was going to be, in a sense, democratized within these old hierarchical organizations, again, based ultimately on the fact that now you're dealing with a more you know, complex and first of all, more complex production system, but also a much better educated workforce, and ones that had to respond to much more affluent and picky customers that had to be responded to, again, in a situation of dispersed authority, all right? Now, so if we just go back over those organization charts, it turns out, I think, that in the end, social capital or networks are not really an alternative to hierarchical organization. You still need hierarchical decision-making because they're much faster, they're more efficient for certain kinds of strategic decision-making, but in fact, you have this mixture of hierarchies and networks in every kind of organization. So if you think about what a society as a whole looks like, you can diagram it through a series of overlapping ovals where, you know, perhaps the large oval is a society as a whole. Some of the small ovals on the inside represent individual companies, organizations. They could represent an ethnic group. They could represent a professional organization. Some of them overlap. Some of them, like immigrant groups, are not wholly contained within that larger society. Every society is built up of these overlapping networks of trust. And indeed, within a single organization, you have not just the formal hierarchy, the formal lines of authority, but you also have a corporate culture. You have a larger set of norms that define the operation of the company as a whole. I think in business school, half of the professors are economists who say human beings are homo economicus, who is motivated by incentives, and the other half are more sociologists that say, no, in fact, human beings are motivated by norms and values. And if the company can project the right sort of values onto its workers, it's going to get a lot more informal cooperation. Now, there are negative aspects to informal networks. So we're all familiar with what a patronage network looks like, which is very destructive of overall efficiency because it's not transparent. It bottles up information within that network, and so not every form of informal organization within a company is good. But I think what's critical to understand is that none of the new forms of authority work without trust, basically without social capital. So if you are going to delegate a greater degree of decision-making in a flat organization to the lowest levels of the organization, you need to trust them. You need to allow people to actually make decisions and also to make mistakes. If you punish people for taking risks and making mistakes in this kind of organization, it's simply not going to work. You might as well go back to an old centralized command and control hierarchical type of system. And you need two kinds of trust. You need vertical trust between the managers and the workers, and you also need trust on a horizontal level between teams, between co-workers. If the people that do the design don't talk to the people that do marketing, if the engineers don't have some appreciation of what customers want, you're also not going to have efficient delegation of responsibility. And so this, in a sense, is, can be applied to the Toyota system, but to any, other flat management system. Obviously, if you're going to outsource, it's not just a matter of efficient communications and transportation technology. You also have to be able to trust the organizations to whom you do the outsourcing, because you're basically turning over the future of your company to somebody else, and if they don't perform, and we've had a number of examples of outsourcing leading to big disasters because, in fact, you outsource aircraft maintenance to a company that doesn't live up to standards, and you get an accident, and that undermines your own customer base. But this is the most, I think, important chart, in a sense, that I think indicates the direction in which innovation has been moving. It's not just that you are going to outsource within a single corporation. I think that the sharing of information in networks that transcend the boundaries of individual organizations is also critical. So I've been living in Silicon Valley now for the last 2 years. I teach at Stanford now. It is very interesting living in Silicon Valley. Everybody in the world travels to Stanford, visits the valley. They talk to, the president of Stanford, and they interview all the venture capitalists and, the entrepreneurs, and they want to know the secret. And I think there is actually a secret, but it's one that is very, very difficult to replicate in other settings because it is based on social capital, essentially. The interesting thing about Silicon Valley, we think of it as atomized, competitive. Individuals do not stay with a single company for a very long time. They're constantly leaving, they're going to a competitor, they're starting, their own company. And so people say, well, this is just an example of capitalist individualism. In fact, that is not true. In fact, there are common norms that pervade the valley that make cooperation much easier in this part of the United States than in other parts. So, for example, lawyers understand, I think, pretty well that a contract written in Silicon Valley will not be as thick as a contract written in New York or Boston or Chicago or another part of the country. Now, why do you have thick contracts? You have thick contracts because you're afraid that your business partner is going to cheat you, and therefore you want to add, a lot of different clauses to cover all sorts of contingencies in case there's opportunism on the part of whoever you're doing business with. In Silicon Valley, you don't need that much because people, it's not just that they trust each other more, but in fact there's less opportunism, and therefore you don't need as much litigation, and you don't need contracts that make bulletproof, business dealings. It's extremely easy to get venture capital because there's a very well-developed industry, but the integration of the VCs and the engineers and the managers based on common, educational backgrounds, they all were electrical engineers at Stanford or Berkeley and worked in the same companies in Fairchild Semiconductor or Intel, and then went on to seed other companies. Something like that now is going on with Facebook, which is itself produced, a whole new generation, a couple of new generations of entrepreneurs since it became successful. It's a kind of ecosystem that is really dependent on social capital, on the ability of these people to trust and work with one another and to share information. There's a story that's told about Intel and AMD in which, as you know, these are the two leading producers of central processing units, microprocessors that are, have been competing with each other viciously in that market for any number of years. And at one point, AMD got a certain piece of capital equipment sooner than Intel did. Its engineers took a couple of months to figure out how to integrate it into the production process. And then they simply told their friends at Intel, said, well, how did you do this? And they said, okay, well, we did such and so. And again, that makes no sense except in a situation of reciprocity. To give away a business secret to a competitor unless you are pretty confident that that business competitor is going to do the same thing for you at a later point in time. And so for all of these reasons, I think that the ability of entrepreneurs to operate fluidly in this situation works not just because of the formal, you need obviously a number of different things. One thing is Stanford University itself was obviously the seed of a lot of these companies, but it had a much more open attitude towards the private sector. It was willing to license deals, and in fact, this is something it still takes me a while to get used to this, but an unbelievable number of Stanford professors, own companies. And in fact, one of my colleagues in my institute is a medical doctor who came from the Harvard Medical School about 5 years ago. And he said to me, I'm the only one of my colleagues that doesn't have a company. Because Harvard was always very standoffish. They said, well, we're Harvard University, we're a respected academic institution, we don't want anything to do with the private sector. Whereas Stanford from the late 1960s on began to say, yeah, okay, the private sector has a lot to teach us. In fact, the entire aeronautical engineering department at Stanford was actually founded by Lockheed Missiles and Space, by a private defense contractor, because they were the ones that had expertise in this field and they needed engineers, and Stanford was willing to work with them. And so this two-way flow between academia and the private sector also had to do with a more open view of the nature of collaboration. And and again, it boils down to a question of trust. All right, so let me finish by, well, okay, so this is a question of where trust comes from. I'm not going to go into this at great length, but we human beings are programmed, in a sense, to generate trust. We're social creatures. We're not we obviously are selfish individuals, but we also have a lot of faculties that allow us to come to cooperate, and in fact we feel bad if we are not following normative behavior that's set by the society around us. And so But we need institutions in order to do this. We don't cooperate unless there are rules, and what institutions are ways of establishing rules that promote cooperation. Some of them come from the society, from factors like religion, from shared culture, from shared language, from shared national experience. Sometimes they are due to political systems, and a lot of times it's simply due to common education. A lot of the success of Silicon Valley has to do with the common educational backgrounds of a lot of the engineers and entrepreneurs that founded a lot of the early companies in that region. All right, so let me finish by talking about politics, because government is actually a pretty critical player in the question of whether trust exists broadly in a society. And governments can play terribly negative roles, but they're also critical in generating social trust. Now, I think in this part of the world, it's pretty clear that governments can be absolutely destructive of the ability of people to cooperate. The whole principle of Leninism was that the government, the state, the party, would be the primary locus of every social connection in the society. And so if you think about what a communist society was, you had things that were labeled trade unions, newspapers, women's groups, and so forth, but none of these were actually truly voluntary organizations. They were all creatures of the state that were used by the state to control individuals. And in fact, if you remember, even down to the level of the family, you know, there was this little monster named Pavel Morozov in Russia who was celebrated by Stalin because he reported his family to the NKVD in the 1930s. And so even at the level of the family, the party state did not want people to trust one another. They only wanted these vertical connections between isolated individuals in the state. And this is why I think many countries that formerly were communist are operating under a burden of distrust, because the state, you know, deliberately generated distrust. I think actually you in Poland are actually fairly well off in this regard compared to Russia itself or Romania or some other former communist countries, because at least in Poland during the whole communist period, you had free agriculture, the church was independent, you had, you know, Solidarność and other civil society organizations even before the collapse of communism. And so the degree of atomization was not as thorough here as in other communist societies, but nonetheless, this is a very difficult legacy to operate from. In a way, France, ever since the old regime, it was never totalitarian, but it had an extremely centralized political system in which individuals were not encouraged to deal with each other on a horizontal level. And part of the dysfunction, I think, in the French political system and the weakness of the private sector in France is due to that. On the other hand, the government is absolutely critical in creating a generalized system of trust if it establishes a real and impartial rule of law. This is one of the most fundamental functions of a modern state. They're selling copies of my new book, The Origins of Political Order, outside. That's not the subject I'm talking about today, but in that book I give a long historical description of where the rule of law in Europe, and not just in Europe, but in other societies as well, came from, because this is really, in a sense, the foundation of broad social trust. If the state enforces the law impersonally, so that you don't have to have family connections or you don't need to be friends of the judge or the ruler in order to get a good ruling out of the court, there's nothing more important than that in establishing a wide radius of trust that allows individuals to interact with one another. Now, in the contemporary world, I think there are two different equilibria that different societies are in, and with regard to the relationship of citizens to the state. So if you go to Germany or Sweden or Denmark, these are all extremely high trust countries. You know, the Swedes and the Danes take 50–60% of GDP and cycle it through the state sector. You have to pay extremely high taxes. There's lots of regulation, but in Scandinavia, people say, well, that's fine because the government provides lots of good services, education, health, healthcare, childcare, and therefore I feel I'm getting something back for my tax dollars. You have a low trust equilibrium that I think is prevalent in Latin America, in very many developing countries in which people do not trust the government. They say, I don't want to pay high taxes because the government is just going to waste the money, that it's going to be squandered, it'll go into political corruption and the like, and therefore they don't pay taxes, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that because people don't want to pay taxes, they don't get good government services, and this then confirms their view that government is ineffective and can't be trusted. And so I don't think that there's actually any appropriate level of government activity. You can make a big welfare state work and you can make a small welfare state work. What is critical is the degree of trust that people have in their government, and you can have a large government, as they do in Scandinavia, and still have it be relatively effective and have citizens believe that it will actually work properly. But getting to that point of trust in government is extremely difficult. Now, why is it that the public sector can never be as reliable, flexible, independent as the private sector? I think there are just a lot of inherent reasons why this is the case. Public officials, they can't share in profits the way you can in a private corporation. Therefore, you don't have incentives towards efficiency. The government can't simply hire and fire people the way a private company can. You've got public sector unions, you've got civil service employment rules and the like, and you've got politicians, basically. I think that's the biggest problem with bureaucracies in the modern world, is that politicians want the government to do contradictory things. They want it, they want a public utility, for example, to recover costs and be efficient, but they also want it to provide universal service to the poor and to their political constituents, and you obviously can't do both of those things simultaneously. But the biggest thing, I think, that separates the private sector from the public sector is in the degree to which private sector organizations are able to delegate authority down to lower levels of the hierarchy. So if you think about the difference between a typical business organization and a public bureaucracy in this respect, it's actually enormous in many countries. So this is my last little chart here. On this one, on the right side of the chart, you have, I would say, what the line represents is a continuum between discretion and accountability. So on the left side, in a high discretion public sector, bureaucrats are allowed to make decisions on their own without a high degree of public oversight. And on the accountability end of the spectrum, bureaucrats are constrained by politics, by democratic choice. And I think you can locate a lot of governments around the world on this spectrum, and neither discretion or autonomy nor accountability is desirable exclusively. Every good government has to be some combination of delegated discretion and autonomy as well as public oversight. And so if you just look on that chart, I would say China is at the very far end on the autonomy side of the scale. Chinese government can make all sorts of decisions very quickly, very rapidly, but with no public accountability because there's no rule of law and no democratic elections. I would say the United States is at the far end on the other side, where the US government oftentimes gets completely paralyzed because there is, in a sense, too much accountability. There are too many checks and balances. And I think that in the middle, there's a kind of zone of trust in which there's a better balance between accountability and discretion. And I would say that's why the better working governments in the world, like Singapore or some of the governments in Northern Europe, earn high trust because they're able to delegate more, but to do so in a way that still remains accountable. And I would say that that's really that's really the challenge for modern governments. And so therefore, you have to build trust. You can't delegate without having capacity. People that work in government have to know how to do things. They have to have the technical expertise. And there has to be an effort to delegate, in a sense, more to that expertise while maintaining the basic principle of accountability. And this is why I think trust in government is actually one of the most difficult things to achieve, because there is no optimal balance between accountability and discretion. You simply, you know you need both of them, but how you actually shift that balance and how you build public trust by having effective government that can deliver services that people want and at the same time remain democratically accountable to the people themselves, that is really the thing that I think none of our modern democratic states has really figured out. So that sums it up. Thank you very much for your attention, and I enjoyed it.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie profesorze. Będziemy mieli niedługo okazję z panem profesorem porozmawiać, tylko niech trochę odsapnie. A teraz poproszę tu panią Bożenę Lubińską-Kasprzak, prezesa Polskiej Agencji Rozwoju Przedsiębiorczości. Niech się pani nic nie boi, nic się strasznego nie stanie. I pana prezesa Arendarskiego, bardzo proszę, prezesa Krajowej Izby Gospodarczej, bo teraz czeka nas wręczenie nagród Innowatika. Domyślaliście się państwo, prawda? Tak, dobrze. Zaczynamy, jeżeli jesteśmy gotowi. Zaczynamy od kategorii Innowacyjna firma. Kapituła nagrody przyznała 2 wyróżnienia dla firmy Politech, spółka z o.o. za zaawansowaną technologię produkcji opakowań do wyrobów kosmetycznych oraz dla Parku Naukowo-Technologicznego Eurocentrum w Katowicach za szeroką działalność wspierającą innowacje, w tym również innowacje proekologiczne. Zapraszamy pana Romana Trzaskalika, prezesa Parku Eurocentrum. Bardzo proszę, panie prezesie. Niestety nie ma z nami delegata Politechu. Firma Politech została zgłoszona przez Izbę Przemysłowo-Handlową Województwa Kujawsko-Pomorskiego, a kandydaturę Eurocentrum zgłosiła Regionalna Izba Gospodarcza w Katowicach. Wie pan, komu trzeba być wdzięcznym, prawda? Gratulujemy gorąco. Proszę nie siadać właśnie, tylko zostać tu z nami. W kategorii Innowacyjna firma nagrodę otrzymuje HM Spółka z ograniczoną odpowiedzialnością za prowadzoną od wielu lat i z dużymi sukcesami działalność produkcyjną i handlową w branży sprzętu medycznego. Firma produkuje i dostarcza na rynek międzynarodowy zaawansowane wyroby stosowane w leczeniu chirurgicznym. Zapraszam pana Michała Harkiewicza, wiceprezesa zarządu. Kandydaturę firmy zgłosiła Izba Przemysłowo-Handlowa w Białymstoku. W kategorii Innowacyjna uczelnia nagrodę otrzymuje Państwowa Wyższa Szkoła w Sulechowie za stworzenie na uczelni Centrum Energetyki Odnawialnej prowadzącego szeroką działalność badawczą. Zapraszam na scenę pana profesora Mariana Miłka, dyrektora Instytutu Politechnicznego uczelni. Bardzo proszę, panie profesorze. Kandydaturę uczelni zgłosiła Zachodnia Izba Przemysłowo-Handlowa. Do środka. W kategorii Innowacyjne rozwiązanie nagrodę otrzymuje pan profesor Jan Szopa-Skórkowski z Zakładu Biochemii Genetycznej Uniwersytetu Wrocławskiego za stworzenie innowacyjnego polskiego lnu, nowego typu lnu o ogromnym potencjale stosowania w medycynie. Zapraszam na scenę pana profesora. Pan profesor jest. Kandydaturę pana profesora zgłosiły Polska Izba Bawełny oraz Polska Izba Lnu i Konopi. No, zwłaszcza te konopie brzmią dobrze w kontekście ostatnich wydarzeń. Tylko z konopiami proszę nie przesadzać przed zakończeniem konferencji. W kategorii innowacyjna osobowość nagrodę otrzymuje pan profesor Stanisław Fic, kierownik Katedry Budownictwa Ogólnego Politechniki Lubelskiej, za wieloletnią działalność naukową i badawczą w dziedzinie budownictwa, w tym za projekty zmierzające do zmniejszenia zużycia energii w budynkach. Kandydaturę pana profesora zgłosiła Lubelska Izba Rzemieślnicza. Nagrodę specjalną III Kongresu Innowacyjnej Gospodarki otrzymuje pan profesor Francis Fukuyama za nie wiem, czy pana z tym wpuszczą do samolotu, prawdę mówiąc, jak to będzie. Nagroda została przyznana za konsekwentnie podejmowane, nieszablonowe i inspirujące próby częściowego choćby wyjaśnienia skomplikowanej społeczno-gospodarczej rzeczywistości. Bardzo gratuluję, panie profesorze. I teraz proszę państwa, żebyście się państwo zechcieli ustawić tak, żeby fotografom było wygodnie. Może troszeczkę do środka. Powinny być jakieś fanfarki w tle teraz, czy coś takiego, prawda? Widzę, że tu jeszcze kolega walczy, więc zostawmy państwa na sekundeczkę. Dziękuję bardzo. Proszę państwa o zajęcie miejsc, a pana profesora Fukuyamę, proszę tutaj. I teraz jest najlepsza okazja, żeby z panem profesorem porozmawiać. To są książki, ja tylko powiem od razu może, żebym potem nie zapomniał, że to jest najnowsza książka Francisa Fukuyamy wydana po polsku, Historia ładu politycznego. Tę książkę można kupić w kuluarach i pan profesor obiecał, że będzie po tej rozmowie podpisywał książkę tu obok w saloniku nazywanym VIP-owskim. Teraz, jeżeli państwo macie pytania, to proszę je przygotować. Chciałem tylko zadać panu profesorowi, może ja na początek, żebyście państwo zdążyli się rozgrzać, jedno pytanie. Panie profesorze, wiele analiz wskazuje, że Polska jest krajem, jak mówi profesor Mancini, włoski socjolog, politolog i medioznawca, jest krajem śródziemnomorskim. To znaczy krajem o kulturze familiarystycznej, paternalistycznej, klientelistycznej, czyli takiej, która w obecnych warunkach niekoniecznie sprzyja modernizacji, rozwojowi, a zwłaszcza temu drugiemu etapowi, kiedy się już zaczyna doganiać najlepiej rozwiniętych i trzeba by samemu coś dołożyć. I chciałem pana poprosić o radę, bo wiem, że po książce Trust napisał pan też książkę State Building. Częścią State Building jest Nation Building. No i jak my możemy sobie z tym problemem poradzić? Czy jest ucieczka? Południowym Włochom się nie udało z tego wyjść. Ale czy są jakieś dobre drogi, żeby sobie z tym radzić?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is I don't believe that Poland is a Mediterranean country.
Geographically not, but...
Well, even socially. You know, as I said, I think that the legacy of communism has been a big burden for every country that went through a communist period. And I think to the extent that to the extent that family and these small networks are still important in Polish life, it's because under communism, that was really the only form of social connection that people were really allowed to have. They couldn't form unions or larger associations and that sort of thing. But compared to a country like Greece or Italy, you have a state that I think is actually much less, of course there's corruption and patronage, but on a scale that's much lower, I think, than that part of Europe. And so that's why I think Poland in this crisis has been able to maintain a fair amount of discipline in its budget. The other thing is, and again, looking at Poland from the outside, you've had a number of historical sources of national unity that many other countries don't have. So the Catholic Church was obviously a big source of national identity. There's a long, historical tradition of a Polish state around which Polish nationalism could be built. And so I think that, these are all foundations on which, the post-communist society has been built. I think that the real problem right now in Europe is the growth of a certain kind of populism that you see all over Europe right now in response to the last financial crisis. And that is the single most important political threat. You've got the rise of right-wing populist parties, in this neighborhood, in Hungary, in Finland, in Sweden, in Holland, in many other Western European countries. And it is due to the failure, I think, of elites who produced, in many ways, the current EU crisis. And that's really the phenomenon that needs to be beaten back. And the only way that you can do that is by actually fixing the institutions at a European level, and then building on the tradition of a pluralistic and open national identity, which I think Poland has already gone a great ways to doing.
Thank you very much. No tak, widziałem tam już ręce, rozumiem, że Państwo jesteście rozgrzani. Bardzo proszę, Pan tutaj się zgłasza. Kto następny będzie, to proszę, o tutaj Pan Minister, proszę, gdyby Pani mogła podać mikrofon. Bardzo proszę, Pan ma głos.
Hello. Professor Fukuyama, thanks very much for a very interesting talk. You talk about social capital replacing formal controls and including contracts, formal contracts. So I'm assuming that you're not perhaps very often invited by law schools or legal companies to give talks. You also talk about the US as relatively high on the scale of trust. And I recall reading research that said that in the US, 11% of the cost of goods and services is actually the costs of legal fees, claims, insurance, and so on. Have you done any research, or is there any research which attempts to create a social capital index based on levels of legal, insurance, claims, costs? Are you aware of any such correlations?
No, I think you're right that in a sense the rate of litigation is a measure of distrust. Robert Putnam, who is the social scientist that's written the most extensively about this, wrote a book about 10 years ago called Bowling Alone, in which he charted the decline of social capital in the United States. And so when I said that the US was traditionally a high social capital country, a lot of people have argued that over the last 40, 50 years, that ability to associate has deteriorated very substantially. Now, there's been a big argument after Putnam wrote that book, whether he was empirically correct, because in many respects, I think the nature of association has shifted. So now it's electronically mediated, through social media. The internet didn't really exist when he was first looking at this issue, whereas many traditional forms of organization had deteriorated. But I think that he would say that the rise of litigation in the United States and the prominence of lawyers and all these costs that you're talking about is, in fact, evidence that Americans don't trust each other to the degree that they once did, and there may be something, in fact, to that.
Thank you. Chcę tylko powiedzieć, że możecie Państwo też zadawać pytania po polsku, ponieważ pan profesor ma tłumaczenie symultaniczne. Proszę, panie ministrze.
Thank you very much. Igor Ostrowski, Ministry of Administration and Digital Affairs. I'll continue in English if that's all right. I wanted to go back to your slide on the networks of trust and the idea of network alliances that create this new ecosystem. I understand that this is as horizontal as it gets, and that's where really knowledge is located at the decision level, at the decision-making level. So my question is it really a hippie movement or a post-hippie movement, or is this a sound business alternative? And the reason I'm asking is because we're very closely looking at what's happening in the United States. We're very closely looking at the open access movement, at this new phenomenon of what we now call the academic spring, and how, let's say, these open source ideas are dripping down to the realm of science, of culture, of education. We've just introduced a pilot project with totally open, CC-based open educational materials. And so I'm thinking, on the one hand, we have the open source, let's say, history, where people like Steve Jobs have actually, let's say, used to create semi-open or now semi-closed business models. We have people like Sergey Brin from Google or Professor Zittrain from Harvard saying, watch out, this post-hippie movement may have been an interesting phenomena, but it's now close to end. We're at the end of a hill, just about to, in front of a, let's say, catastrophe of the open access movement. And would that then result in a loss of trust? What's your opinion about these sort of two different calls?
Yeah. Well, I think that you can go too far in a number of different directions. So, for example, I think the open source movement worked well in information technology because any given piece of intellectual property in that industry was not so valuable that it meant the life or death of a larger organization that produced it, and so therefore you could have, sharing. In the chemical industry, knowledge of one molecule can mean hundreds of millions of dollars of future revenues, and if you give that to a competitor, you're basically giving away the entire, business that you've generated. And so I think in certain kinds of biochemistry, open source doesn't work at all. And I think, in typical fashion, people in Silicon Valley hop on one trend like open source and believe that it's the future of all mankind, and it's really not. You need hierarchy, you need property rights, intellectual property rights, you need a certain amount of ownership of intellectual property in order to motivate how people work. But I do think that there is this fundamental insight that there is a more efficient way of sharing information other than the formal buying and selling of property rights. That where you can do this effectively, in those sectors where you can do it, if it's based on informal norms, it's simply going to be more efficient, and it won't work everywhere, but in areas where it does work, I think that you need to stick to it. Furthermore, it's very complex in science. A lot of scientific research proceeds by these overlapping networks. There is proprietary knowledge, and scientists are jealous of one another, but science would not work, without the basic kind of openness that's enforced by, academic standards of publication and so forth. So the answer is a little bit yes, a little bit no.
Thank you. Kto z Państwa ma mikrofon? Nikt jeszcze nie ma mikrofonu. O, proszę. Tylko prosiłbym bardzo krótkie pytania, dobrze?
Dzień dobry, nazywam się Krzysztof Bańka. Chciałem zapytać, pan powiedział, że lokalnie należy szukać takich struktur wzrostu. Jak pan myśli, w jaki sposób odnajdywać, prowokować tą lokalną społeczność do tworzenia tych wzrostów, a z drugiej strony jak odnajdywać te źródła wzrostu, żeby później je można było rozwijać? Dziękuję.
Dziękuję.
Well, if I could answer that question, I'd be a rich man, because every society, country, region, wants an answer to that. Let me just give you, however, something that I think is in the realm of possibility, just a story from my own university, from Stanford. So in the early 1960s, Stanford was known as a rich boys' university. It did not have very high academic standards. It accepted almost half of all the students that applied to it. They tended to come from wealthy families, didn't want to work very hard. And there was one visionary president of Stanford that said, we're going to change this. We're going to turn this university into a first-class engineering university. We're going to change the basis on which it interacts with the local private sector, with government, make it more open. And within a 10, 15-year period, he actually succeeded in, creating the kind of Stanford that then became the seed for, Hewlett-Packard and Intel and, any number of companies in Silicon Valley. And, that won't work everywhere. But I think clearly, since innovation is so much based on intellectual and human capital and the kind of social capital I was mentioning, this kind of institutional shift in the relationship between the producers of knowledge and the people that can then apply it in a practical way and commercialize it is something that is in the realm of, of possibility for, countries that want to achieve growth.
Thank you. Czy któryś z kolegów dziennikarzy chciał zadać jakieś pytanie może? Proszę, pani. No.
I work for Bloomberg here in Poland, and I was just wondering, you mentioned or you pointed several threats. You must be aware that there is generally one threat right now about Greece dropping out of Eurozone. And you also pointed into the correlation between social capital and how well organizations can work, right? Do you believe that having so different level of social trust among European countries, they can actually stay in one financial body?
Yeah, I actually gave a lecture about this in Geneva last December. I think that one of the great failings of the European Union was that its creators always regarded it as a kind of technocratic enterprise that was basically aimed at economic efficiency. And they invested relatively little in actually creating a common European identity. So they built the structure of a European Union without building a European nation, in some respect. And what it means to have a nation is to have a common set of values, positive values, so that you can say, I'm a European, and what that means is the following. I mean, whatever definition you give it. So in Germany today, a rich German feels a sense of moral obligation to a poor German. And that's why Germany has a relatively strong welfare state, because there is this shared sense of living in the same society and having obligations to one another. But I think in the development of the EU, there was never any investment made in defining, European citizenship and therefore the obligations that Europeans had to one another. And now, unfortunately, I think it's too late. I mean, I think that Europe will be lucky simply to hold as much of the existing structure together as possible. And in fact, the crisis has now re-emphasized national differences between Greeks and Germans, among others, and that's been quite destructive.
Dziękuję, bardzo proszę. Proszę bardzo.
Yes, my name is Cliff Bates. I'm at Washington University's American Studies Department. I'd have a question based on the answer you just gave him. To what degree does racial, ethnic homogeneity give a level of trust that would allow people like countries like Sweden to trust, to accept high tax rates and these things, whereas societies like America or third world countries that are so heterogeneous have to rely on law, and law that's very nasty, that creates fear, in order to maintain a element of trust, to create the trust that's lost. So, and also to the question of the European Union aspect, wasn't the failure not to give the European Union and monetary forces enough negative tools, sticks, to coerce members to trust? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, yes, I think sharing common ethnicity, values, language makes trust easier, although I should point out that, you have a high level of distrust even in ethnically homogeneous countries. You can learn to distrust people over a whole range of issues. But I think that, I think it's pretty clear in retrospect that the EU expanded too rapidly. It probably took in some members that it shouldn't have, that didn't really qualify on entry into the EU, and there was no mechanism to discipline them once they were in. And that in the future, probably a less ambitious agenda would make the organization work better. But, heterogeneity is not an inevitable obstacle to creating trust, because you can have societies that are, in the United States, again, it's complicated because I think our racial divisions are one of the reasons that we don't have a big welfare state. So there are degrees to which this is true, but I think you can create a common citizenship and culture based on political values and not, simply on ethnic or racial ones, and that's perfectly possible.
Bardzo proszę.
Ja się nazywam Andrzej Budzyk, jestem jednym z 2 polskich mediatorów po geologii, jeśli nie będziemy liczyli oczywiście pana Rendarskiego. A dzisiaj jestem również dziennikarzem mediów elektronicznych. Chciałem zapytać pana profesora o taką hipotetyczną sytuację, którą przedstawiał w swoich pracach wcześniej. Otóż on mówił, że potrafi sobie wyobrazić gospodarkę, w której siła wyższa likwiduje bezrobocie, a właściwie nie pozwala prawnie na zwalnianie ludzi. Czy mógłby, i łączył to, że w takiej gospodarce jest większy kapitał społeczny. Czy mógłby kilka słów po latach powiedzieć o tej wersji, którą przedstawiał w swojej jednej z książek, którą zresztą mieliśmy w Polsce? Oczywiście pełne zatrudnienie jest niemożliwe, ale taką hipotetyczną sytuację kiedyś pan profesor przedstawiał.
I'm not quite sure. You may be referring to the discussion of the Japanese lifetime employment system that I wrote about in my book, Trust, which, see, this is the thing that I think you have to understand about the phenomenon of trust. It is good to have trust in a society when people are trustworthy, but there are also times in which you need greater accountability and you need change. And in some respects, an extremely high trust society like Japan was in the 1980s, with lifetime employment, with loyalty to single companies, was not appropriate when Japan hit a competitive level that required, major restructuring of big Japanese corporations, greater encouragement of small companies, of entrepreneurship. And that high trust system then actually turned out to be a big obstacle to reforming the Japanese economy. And in that respect, these small Chinese family-owned businesses were actually much more adaptable in that particular environment. And so I would never argue that trust by itself is always necessarily a good thing. Sometimes, high trust institutions are an obstacle to change, and sometimes we need actually greater accountability, and you need revolutions in organization, which necessarily, in a sense, undermine trust.
Dziękuję bardzo. Czy ktoś z kolegów dziennikarzy jeszcze chciał? Nie, to proszę bardzo.
Szymon Gutkowski, DDB Warsaw and Project Poland Association. You have spoken about difficulty to reach balance between discretion and accountability in governments. You've shown how corporations have changed their structure from a very vertical, hierarchical structure to a mixture of networks of trust and hierarchy. That inspires me to a broader question. Do you see with the current possibilities in technology, development of social media, development of these informal networks that have done Linux or that contribute to Wikipedia, do you see that democracy has reached its limits and we are about to see a new model of democracy, or these new tools will just make the current democracy more efficient?
This is, I think, the central challenge, that you need government and you need a public sector for a whole range of functions. But I think everybody is aware that the old bureaucratic model that we are familiar with from the 20th century doesn't work very well. There are too many rules, it's too rigid, you can't fire people, you can't innovate, you can't, restructure operations in the way that a private business can. And so I think we are desperately in need of a new model for the private sector, where people are allowed to take risks, they can make mistakes, they can experiment in the public sector. And right now we don't have that. And part of the reason we don't have that is, because politically we have totally unrealistic expectations for what the public sector is supposed to do. That if you're going to allow people to experiment and take risks, every now and then they're going to screw up, and if you punish them for screwing up, they're not going to take risks, right? And so this is one of those issues where, I'm not smart enough to figure out how you get to this new form of government. But I do realize that this old hierarchical, so in a certain sense, what I was trying to say in the last part of my talk is that the business world has moved away from this hierarchical, bureaucratic, Taylorite model of organization to something much more flexible, and that the government needs to do this as well. But for political reasons, it's very, very difficult for the government to do this. And that's really, I think, the challenge if you're going to end up with a government that people can trust, that it really does need to be made flexible in this sense.
Thanks.
Leszek Izdebski, Cisco Systems, Silicon Valley. We seem to be observing two different types of social correlations within the internet that are evolving. One of them very positive, another one very negative. On the positive side, self-organizing business groups driven by similar desires, all of a sudden enabling something to happen very quickly in informal way. On the other hand, actually in Geneva 2 weeks ago, we were interviewing kids from high school about news. What do you trust? And the response was, not traditional media, they have reasons to lie. If I read something written by a specific single person, of course I can trust it. If it's written by media, I cannot trust it, which creates obviously a very interesting dichotomy between those two movements. How do you think this is going to impact the society?
Well, we've got this paradox where you now have much more bandwidth and many more ways of delivering media and communications. At the same time that there's actually been a breakdown in the trust that people have of the media. And part of it is that because everyone can talk to people that are similar to them, they do that, and they don't trust people outside of that particular small group. This was actually predicted in a book by a political scientist, Ithiel de Sola Pool, back in the 1970s, that we'd face this phenomenon. What the internet has done is taken away all of the middlemen all of the gatekeepers that used to vet information, that used to edit, that used to determine what people saw, and now everything can go up, without that mediation. But what that means is that in many ways, a lot of it is less, is less trustworthy, and that's led to, I think, a general deterioration of people's willingness to accept information from other sources and so forth. Now, again, this is one of those issues. I don't know where this is leading. I actually think that you still need gatekeepers in many respects. You need editors, and you need a media that will vouch for the accuracy of information. And in some sense, that has to return, that kind of mediation has to return. But what form that's going to take, I don't know, because I think that the business models for the traditional media are really pretty broken, probably less so here in Poland than in the United States, where, that's breaking down very rapidly.
Thank you. One more
Professor
question.
Fukuyama, what I think I have one question is about big picture. We know that we're living in a world of big networks. My question is that in this age of rapid globalization, is there still place for countries?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't quite.
Of course. We live in a world of big networks, as you said in your great speech. So my question is that in this age of very rapid globalization, do we still need some kind of like countries? Because we live in...
Countries?
Yes.
Oh yeah, no. I think this idea that you can do away with sovereignty and the nation state is one of the biggest illusions that we've had over the last couple of decades, because there are certain functions that only governments can provide. They're the only ones that can be the locus of democratic legitimacy. They're the only ones that can enforce laws. They're the only ones that can legitimately create a rule of law. We don't know how to do that internationally. And you can't do that through transnational networks or NGOs or other forms. So I think we're moving to a world in which nation states coexist with other forms of organization, in which there's a lot more international interaction and requirement for different kinds of cooperation at different levels. But we're never going to do away with the need for a nation state.
Thanks. And the very last question, ostatnie pytanie. Bardzo proszę.
A very simple question, more on a personal level now. You've mentioned your colleagues at Stanford, professors who own companies. Have they made you already to think about setting up your own company?
No, I really have no... well, first of all, what I do is just give speeches and lectures, and I don't have any brilliant ideas that I think I could commercialize into a company. That's really for the engineers and the biologists. But I think it's, it's a very interesting model. I mean, I think that the interaction of that academic community with the private sector is something that's really new in the world, and I do think that it's a kind of, people can learn a lot from that, even if I personally don't, plan to set up my own company.
Thank you very much, Professor Fukuyama.